Now, let's talk first of all a bit about blending modes. So let me open this color picker, because this palette or this color picker that you see is going to be very, very important. Now, we've already seen that there are certain blending modes: hue, saturation, luminosity, and color. These were the four blending modes that are important to us because they are a part of the color family. And to be frank, within these also, only two are important to us, which are hue and color. If you understand these two, most of your work will be done, because most of the times when we're changing colors, these two are used. And we'll also be seeing what the differences are there between these two blending modes. But first of all, let's pay attention to three terms that we have actually been seeing in this course for quite some time, okay? But we really haven't understood what they exactly mean. What are those three terms? Remember, we've been seeing this abbreviation HSB or L in most of the cases. So when you say B, B stands for brightness, but some of the other places, for example, in Photoshop, you might see it as L, because that stands for luminance. And like I mentioned in the last video, these terms are interchangeable. But we are basically, when we say L, luminance or luminosity, or B, brightness, we're just talking about how bright the pixel is. Okay, we're talking about the brightness of it, right? So you can ignore pretty much everything here. Let's just keep our focus, because we are seeing those terms again. HSB, or you can call it right now HSL also, doesn't matter. So H stands, like we've seen before, for hue. Now, what does hue mean? Hue means just the color, okay? So right now you can see that the radio button here is checked to H. So these two, this square and this vertical thin bar that you're seeing here, are going to be important if we are to understand how these things work. Since the radio button is set to H, this vertical bar is now representing hue. We can change this, but don't worry about that right now. For example, if I select S, which is for saturation, now this is the saturation bar. If I select B, which is brightness, this is the brightness bar, okay? Let's keep it to H, because this is the default and it's a good way to understand things. So H for hue, S for saturation, B for brightness. What is the difference between the three? Hue means just the color. So you can see here, right? If you see this bar, it kind of looks like that color wheel that we saw, like a vertical representation of that. So if I move this indicator, can you see only the hue value is changing? Like I said, ignore everything here, only these three. So only the hue value is changing. And just see, if you see here, the color is changing, right? So hue just means color. Okay, I want pink hue. I want yellow hue. So it's pretty easy to understand that, yes, this is just the color, right? Next comes saturation. Saturation is about how vibrant or vivid the pixel is. And what this means in terms, now we come to this big square that you see, okay? So here, how can you understand what saturation is? So let's say right now I placed my mouse here on the corner, right here, and we are seeing that, yes, this is going to be yellow color if we had to pick, right? Very close to like a vibrant yellow color. But just see what starts happening if I move this from right all the way to left. Keep an eye out on this S value that you're seeing here, okay? So just see. And also on this color that you're seeing here. So just see. Right now, it's set all the way to 100. So at this particular hue, we have the most vibrant or the vivid yellow that is there. But as I start moving this, you see. Just notice amongst those three values, which is changing. S, saturation. And keep an eye out on that color. Can you see it is becoming less and less vivid and vibrant as I move towards the left. And you can see now so many grays start to come in that it pretty much is going to become white in this case. Or if let's say I was somewhere in between, it would become gray. Again, if I move it here, we get that saturation back for this particular shade this time. So this is the maximum vivid or vibrancy exactly for this shade. But if I take it here, the S value goes down. But no other value is changing amongst those three, only S. So here basically what happened when you reduce the saturation of something, you must have heard of a desaturated image, right? In a lot of software, black and white images are called as desaturated image, or the effects are called as desaturate image. It's the same thing. You're basically turning down the vibrancy till the time you basically get the grays, right? So it's not vivid or vibrant anymore. And when the saturation is 0, it's basically not going to have any color, right? So this is saturation. Finally, we have B, brightness or luminosity. L means the same thing. But again, let's see that. So this time, if I make this movement like this, up to down or down to up, just see what value changes. You're going to see this value change and see the change here. This time you're going to notice something different as I move down. So can you see as we move down and that value changes, as this value goes down, that color becomes darker and darker and darker till the time it basically becomes black. As you move up, again, only that value is changing, and this is going to give us a really bright color. Doesn't matter which color or hue it is, it's going to apply the same principle. So brightness is about the different shades of the dark color and the light color depending on which, where you are on this palette. So you can have, for example, a color which is less saturated. You can see here the saturation of this color is very less, but it can still have a higher, like it can be a darker, less saturated color because we're moving it here. See? So the more brighter it is, the higher the value, the less brighter it is, or the darker it is, the less this value. So you should just know these things, because why this is important from a blending modes point of view is that here's the important thing. Remember, I said there are 2 blending modes that you have to be aware about. One is the hue blending mode and one is the color blending mode in that last family. Now, here's what happens. When you select the hue blending mode, it only blends in such a way that it only changes or takes into account the hue of the new color. It ignores the saturation and brightness of the new color that you've put. That's why in the last time in the car example, it only changed the color. Simply because in the hue blending mode, it will not change these 2 things. So there's no question of the luminosity changing. There's no question of the saturation changing. So basically, the image still maintains the same look, only the hue gets changed. Okay, we'll again understand this in the next video also, because I'll actually be opening those 2 layers so that you'll understand how exactly it works. But right now, just kind of discussing it in a very easy way, okay? In the color blending mode, there's just one difference, which is that it takes into account the hue, but it also takes into account the saturation. And this is also going to be important, especially, for example, in this image, and you'll understand why later on when we start editing this image. So, hue blending mode only affects the hue, only takes in the hue from the new color that you've put. Color blending mode takes the hue as well as the saturation of the new color that you have put. Might be slightly confusing, don't worry. Let's actually see this happening in the next video. All right, welcome back. So let's see these 2 blending modes in action when it comes to changing the background color in this particular image. So we've got already the selection of the background because we had inverted it. And this time let's use a different function. We've been using the hue saturation adjustment function. This time when you sometimes know that, yes, I want to change this particular color, another function that is used often is this solid color function. This just basically means you give it a color. That's it. There's no movement of the slider and all here. You pick the color and you just do it. And sometimes this is pretty straightforward to use when it comes to changing the color. So let's say we want to change this to something which is blue, okay? So we're going to open the solid color adjustment function and you're going to get that palette back. And let's say that I really want a bright blue background like this, okay? So we hit OK. And you can see, just like last time, because we had an active selection this time of the background, you can see the background is white, the subject is black. We've got a nice layer mask, and this time it is opened with this solid color adjustment. And we can change the color anytime that we want by double clicking on this and selecting a different color. But that's not too important right now. Now, in this case, first of all, straight away when we do this, this is actually one of the biggest mistakes made by a lot of beginner photographers, that when they change the background, they just leave it at this. And this looks like pretty fake, as you can see here. And why does it look fake? Because if I was to hide this, it doesn't take into account the luminosity of the original layer or the image. For example, we have shadows here, we've got more light falling on this part of the background, less light falling on the corners, and all this is not being taken into account. It's like just putting something opaque on top of it, and therefore it looks very fake, right? And this is the reason why we use blending modes, because they help us blend the images together. So if we open up our blending modes with this layer selected, you can see here we are interested in the last family. So let's test both of them. So remember, in the last car image, the hue blending mode just worked so perfectly, right? But this time, let's actually select hue and let's see something. Can you see that there was barely any change this time? Let's see the before and after. Before, after. It's a very slight change. You probably won't be able to even notice it. Before, after. But a very slight hue of blue has come. That's it, right? Why is this happening? Why did the background not change like last time? We'll soon find out. But this time, before that, let's also see which is the other important blending mode in this family, color. Let's also hit color. Now, suddenly this starts to look much more vibrant, and you can see the before and after. And this doesn't even look fake because you can see all those shadows and those bright areas still intact. It's almost like, yes, this was against a light blue background. So what exactly has happened here? You already know how the two blending modes work, but this time let's see it in much more detail. So what we're going to do is, right now, let me just hide this layer so that whatever we've done with this is not important. We're going to zoom into this image because the main part of this image is the background, right? Let's open the color picker and let's just click somewhere because this pretty much is of a similar color, right? It's like a kind of whitish gray color. So let me just click anywhere, something like this. And what you notice is it's moved here, right? It's showing us which shade this color is. Now, if you notice the values, just see, because this is so much towards the gray side of things, like this side, and remember what happens when you move towards the left to the saturation? It becomes less or more? It becomes less, right? You can only see 3. And basically, a desaturated color is like kind of moving towards the black and white side of things, right? So it's not going to have any vividness or vibrancy, right? And you can see it's telling us what shade of the color this is. So on the hue slider, this is some 70. And it's also telling us about the brightness of this pixel. But the most important thing here is it doesn't have too much saturation. Now, let's do another thing. Let me close this. Let me open this change that we had made. Okay, now remember we had changed it to color, but right now, let's just change this to normal, like the first thing, the opaque thing. Let's open our color picker again, and let's see the new value. So can you see it's literally like showing us exactly what we had selected, and if we see the saturation here is 100, right? So in the previous case, the original image basically had this area where almost there was no saturation. The color that we're trying to put has a very vibrant saturation, a higher saturation, right? Now, we also changed then this blending mode to hue, but we found that nothing really happened here. Why? So this is now we're looking at the new pixel, right? Because this is set to hue. Let's also see this now. If we select any other color here, because this is after the hue blending mode has been applied, it is still somewhere here. That's why there's no change in color. Now, why is this happening? Because remember, as we discussed before, hue, when you use the hue blending mode, it keeps the original image's saturation and brightness values. They don't change. It only takes the hue from the new layer. So here's how you have to understand things. Here's the terminology for this when it comes to blending modes. The top layer, okay? So this is the layer to which we applied the blending mode on, right? We changed its blending mode to hue. This top layer is called as the blend layer. Either you can use this term, or sometimes it's also called as the active layer. So when it comes to blending, these two layers are involved, right? So the top layer in which you've put the blending mode is the blend layer, also called as the active layer. The image under the layer underneath it, okay, that is called either as the base layer or the underlying layer. So I like to use underlying layer because it's pretty easy to understand that this is below the layer. So blend layer, an underlying layer. So here's what happens in the hue blending mode. It blends these two layers in such a way that from the blend layer or from the active layer, it is only taking into account the hue. So definitely the hue has changed. Can you see? It is the same hue of this particular color that we had used here. But it is still not showing any color because it only takes the hue but keeps the saturation and the brightness of the underlying layer. So from the active layer, it only takes hue, doesn't blend anything else. It just blends things in such a way, hue from this, saturation and brightness from this. So even though the color itself changed, because the saturation still remained from the bottom layer, which had no saturation, we are basically getting a blue color which has no saturation, and therefore we are basically not seeing any change. Okay, now let's also do the other thing. Let's go over to color, and this made a good change, right? Because remember, this time let's open up the color picker again and let's choose something like this. Now can you see the saturation is higher? It has taken some saturation from this active or the blend layer also. Why? Because this now blends in such a way that it takes into account the hue and the saturation. So both H and S from the top layer or the active layer or the blend layer, and only keeps the brightness or the luminosity of the underlying layer. And that is important to us because we do want that lighting which created that image to be there. We only want the hue and saturation because that's going to affect the color to change and take in from this blend layer. But this time, because it is also taking into account the saturation, okay, now don't worry about why isn't the saturation exactly the same. There's a lot of complex calculation involved in that. But the point is, you can see that this has a higher saturation because this blend mode takes in the saturation of the new color. And that is the reason this blue that has come here, because it has a higher saturation, we can actually see it. Because it's not towards the left of that palette, somewhere towards the middle or the right, and therefore this is much more vibrant. So does this mean that the color blending mode is better than the hue blending mode? No, not always. Like we saw in the image before, if your underlying image already had a good amount of saturation. Remember that car was already, it had a color which had saturation. It was not like a gray or whitish gray car, right? It already had a saturation. In that case, sometimes hue is actually better because then there's no other change. You're not altering the image in any other way. But in this case, for example, the color mode worked better for us. It's completely going to depend on image to image. But the important thing is you have to understand at least, or you should know how these blending modes work. So I hope that you were able to understand that. And we are going to see a couple of other examples also in this section. So we'll do that in the next video. And then finally, we'll actually be coming back to this image because we will also see how to select things properly. Because here you can see, right, even though we made the change in color, the hair part is not looking good because the selection wasn't accurate. So we'll soon be coming back to this image because this is also left. Even though this is not a part of blending modes, but we'll still be focusing on select and mask to refine our selection. But anyway, I'll see you in the next video where we'll see some more examples.